Hello, everyone. Hey, I'm really glad that you're here, and I'm glad to have a chance to be with you today also. The most famous sermon ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount, and the opening segment of that sermon is a series of statements that begin with what word? Do you know? Blessed. Some pronounce it blessed. I guess it sounds more churchy if you say it blessed. But we call these statements the Beatitudes, and we've been focusing on one of them for each of the last several weeks. But the Beatitudes mess with our minds because they seem to contradict how the world works. They sound irrational, maybe even absurd, because most of them claim that we are blessed by things that do not seem like blessings. Or they call us to behave like sheep in a world full of wolves. Do you recall the Beatitudes that we've covered so far? Blessed are the poor in spirit. To be poor in any sense seems like something we should avoid. And yet Jesus said it is a blessing to reach the end of my rope and to reach out for God. Note to self. Blessed are those who mourn. Isn't mourning the opposite of being blessed? Well, no, because it is better to mourn and receive comfort from God than to never have a reason to mourn or to never realize that I do have a reason. And that is profound insight for people who are suffering or sad or blind to their own sin. Note to self. Blessed are the meek. It's better to be completely humble and gentle than to prod and push and presume your way through life. But don't the prodders, don't the pushers, don't the presumers run this world? Well, it may seem like it at times, but the meek will inherit the earth. Note to self. Blessed are the merciful. Pronouncing judgment feels so powerful, and some people live for that rush, but judgment bringers make themselves and everyone around them miserable. Bringing mercy is a happier way to live, Jesus said. Note to self. So today we come to verse 8 of Matthew 5, where Jesus speaks the beatitude that I find the most intimidating. And it's a good sign if your initial response to it is similar to mine, rather than thinking, oh, yeah, I'm nailing this one. So here it is. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. As I was about to graduate from Bible college, one of my mentors asked what I was most concerned about as I thought about the next chapter of my life, working at a church, leaving college. Well, I was single, so maybe I should have said I was most concerned about finding a wife, but I did not say that. I had about $22 in the bank. So maybe I should have said covering my expenses is my greatest concern, but I did not say that either. I was inexperienced, so perhaps I should have said figuring out what I'm supposed to be doing while I work for this church. Maybe that should have been my answer, but I wasn't transparent enough or informed enough to say that. When he asked what concerned me most about the future, the answer that came out of my mouth was faking it. I explained that during college, I had learned to think on my feet, to string words together, to persuade people, and that it was a little frightening to realize that I had the capacity to hide behind those words or to exploit those words. And while it was nice to hear my mentor say he did not expect to see me take that path, I have always been afraid of waking up one day and realizing I am a hypocrite. I knew I would always be a sinner, but I did not want to be a hypocrite. In Jesus' day, the Greeks had a powerful word for hypocrite. It was a theatric term that meant to wear a mask. Ancient actors would often portray multiple characters in a theatric production. So to switch characters, they would not do complete costume changes, but they would switch masks. And that's why we always see artwork like this when we go to a theater. That logo is a throwback to the masks that ancient actors would wear. The frown and the smile depict tragedy and comedy. Actors attempt to evoke concern or sadness or anger, happiness, laughter from the audience. That's what actors do. Actors pretend to be someone in the hope of evoking a specific response. And some actors are so good at specific kinds of characters, they are typecast. Have you seen that? Hollywood cannot help but design similar roles for them because their fans just eat it up every time. And honestly, that is perfectly fine with me in some cases. When I see that Liam Neeson is in a new film, I know it will be the same concept as his last 5 films, with an only slightly different plot. But I am still going to that movie. I am still going to watch that movie. When I see Tom Cruise is in a new movie, I know he is going to play some kind of hotshot. Used to be a young hotshot, now it's an older hotshot. When I see Clint Eastwood in a new film, I know that he is going to play a bad person who reluctantly does a good thing. And lately, I know that a woman 50 years younger than him is going to flirt with him during that movie. It's nice to be not just the actor, but the director. You get to decide who flirts with you. I did some theater in high school and college, but we always had as many actors as we had characters in the production, so I never witnessed acting with masks until my wife and I went to a theatric version of Alfred Hitchcock's 39 Steps in San Diego a few years ago. And there was one riveting scene where the 4 actors used masks to jump back and forth between characters. And that is the image that Jesus is going for when he warns the religious leaders of his day, woe to you, you hypocrites, you actors, you performers, you pretenders, you mask wearers. By the way, whenever Jesus says, woe to you, pay attention. Have you ever seen a stop sign with flashing lights around the perimeter of the sign? Now, the sign should be enough to send the message. There's a big STOP on the sign, and you know you're supposed to stop. But when there are lights around the edge of the sign, it is a warning that an especially dangerous intersection is ahead. And when Jesus says the word woe, it is flashing lights around a stop sign. It is like a parent saying, if I have to tell you one more time. It is like an employer saying, I'm making a note of this in your personnel file. It is like a judge saying, if you ever come before me again on this matter, it will not go well for you. Friend, when Jesus says, woe to you hypocrites, you do not want him to be referring to you or your actions or your life. Now, we throw the word hypocrite around a lot. I mean, we use it to discredit people with whom we disagree, even if it doesn't apply. You know, the people we like are inconsistent, the people we dislike are inconsistent, but the people we dislike are hypocrites. That's kind of how we use the word. And we label people hypocrites if they don't think or speak or act the way we prefer. It's a form of manipulation to tag someone hypocrite. But Jesus used the word hypocrite to refer to a person who is artificial, who is fraudulent at the core. The Apostle Paul admitted that he often did things he did not want to do. But that is not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is a complete disconnect between the internal part of a person and the external part of a person. Hypocrites are concerned only with managing their image, not living up to that image. Hypocrites decorate the house on the outside while the infrastructure is crumbling. They are not concerned with the state of their hearts. Solomon wrote much of the book of Proverbs as advice for his own children, and he stressed how important it was for them to be aware of their own hearts. Solomon talked a little bit about their reputations, how other people might perceive them, but Solomon focused mostly on their hearts, who they actually were. And Solomon said this, guard your heart above all else. Whatever you think is important, make this more important. Guard your heart, for it determines the course of your life. Now, most of us would say, my decisions determine the course of my life. Solomon said, no, It is your heart, the condition of your heart, the quality of your heart. That is going to determine the course, the direction of your life. In other words, your life and your decisions cannot outperform your heart. Of all the dangers that you and I face, none is greater than the possibility that our hearts might become corrupt or calloused or artificial. No wonder Jesus said, it is a blessing to be pure in heart. So how can you and I know if our hearts are in trouble? What does an impure heart look like? Well, one indicator of an impure heart is when my words are right, but my life is not. Now, you don't have to be around believers very long. You don't have to be around the church very long before you realize that Christians have a unique vocabulary when it comes to some things. Christians have some actions, some things, some words that Christians tend to expect from each other. And over time, most of us learn how that works. And some of you know the catchphrases very well. And if you're really clever, you can begin to use those catchphrases to deflect or to deceive or to give an impression that may not be accurate. You can make people think that your heart is doing better than it is. A few years ago, I visited my son in Phoenix, and big shocker, we went to play golf. And we were paired with two men that we did not know, and to be honest, these guys were a lot of fun. We loved them. They were loud, but they were fun. And they were both retired, they were both divorced, and they partied together often. And they had lots of stories to tell. They just didn't know who they were telling them to. Stories about drinking too much, stories about women, stories about questionable financial dealings. But they were inclusive. They told us that they were headed to a bar in Scottsdale that night, and we were invited to come along. First round was on them, and there would be lots of women. Evan and I got in the golf cart. He leaned over and said, I don't think they know who you are. I said, not yet, but just wait. So we played the front nine. We grabbed a snack. And as we waited for a par 3 to clear on the back nine, one of them asked the magic question. So Ed, you know, sometimes people take my name, Eddie, and they want to give me an adult name, so they say, Ed. So Ed, what do you do? And I said, well, I work at a large nonprofit with branches across the globe. No, I told them. I said, I'm a pastor, and my son works for a church here in Phoenix. And that is when the miracle occurred. Because up to that point, we had played golf, and we had talked about partying and about women, but after that point, we played golf and we talked about church. I mean, these guys had to have some history in the church because they were too good at using church language and asking church questions. What type of church? What denomination is your church? How large is your church? And the language became pristine. I mean, the language was better than when I played golf with some of my preacher pals, to be honest. And instead of bleep this and bleep that, it was, golly gee, that was a bad shot. My. And for some reason, at the end of the round, they did not repeat the invitation for me to go clubbing with them. I don't understand. Now look, maybe the change in conversation was simply a gesture of respect. They didn't want to offend. But I suspect something in the hearts of those two golfers was testifying against all the things they revealed on the front nine. So they changed masks on the back nine. And it wasn't real repentance. They didn't want to clean up the entire house. They hadn't had an epiphany about the way that they were living. They wanted to stuff trash under the couch cushions. They wanted to sweep stuff under the rug. And friend, that kind of pretending is not a behavior problem. That is a heart problem. And that is what Jesus is trying to teach us. Using our words to create a good impression that is a false impression is not a mistake. It is a sham. And Jesus spoke against it in the strongest terms. He said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Imagine Jesus saying that about you or saying that to you. Imagine Jesus saying, "Hey, Eddie, impressive words, impure heart." And remember, the Beatitudes are about how to live well, how to get the most meaning out of life. They are about how to experience blessing and happiness. Jesus is trying to teach us that if we want to live with a sense of well-being, our words and our hearts, our entire lives must align. That's what he's calling us to. Happiness comes from living a fully aligned life, from not having to manage the pieces of your life to make sure they don't expose one another. That is a pure-hearted life. And Jesus doesn't just say, you should live that way. He says, you are blessed if you live that way. You are happier if you live that way. But it's not just our words that can be hypocritical. Another sign of an impure heart is when my worship looks right, but I am unchanged by God. And that goes to the question of whether or not we come to this place or we tune in online hungry and humble, knowing that we need to hear from God, knowing that there needs to be ongoing transformation in our lives, or whether we have come to put in our time or check the box, or whether we are putting the show in showing up. You know, we put a premium on our Sunday gatherings as a church. I mean, we believe in corporate worship. We believe that people walk more closely with God and discover the will of God better and quicker when they make being here a priority. We have seen that again and again. Good things happen in people's lives when God's people come together this way. But in Mark 7:7, Jesus said this about some people who attended worship at every opportunity that came their way, but who didn't truly worship. He said their worship is a farce. Other translations render that statement, they worship me, say those last two words with me, in vain. When is the last time you did something in vain? That phrase means pointless, means wasted, it means futile, or futile if you're a Star Trek fan and you remember the Borg. It means useless. When I was in college, I had professors who were lenient and I had professors who were rigid. And some were gracious, and when papers were turned in late, they would accept them. They would accept almost any excuse, nearly always caved on late assignments. Other professors would set a deadline and they would refuse to compromise on that deadline. One of my classmates was infamous for completing assignments late. He once missed a deadline for a term paper, but stayed up all night to finish the assignment so that he could turn it into the professor the following day. And when he got to the professor's office, there was a note on the door that read, "Gone for the day. If you're here to submit a term paper, refer to the syllabus. No late work will be accepted." So the student slid the paper under the professor's office door and began praying for the best. A couple days later, he received his paper back. And on it was a note that read, "This paper was well written, but as previously stated, late work is not accepted. You wasted your time." And the grade on the cover sheet of the paper was a 0. All that work, that all-night vigil to finish his term paper, it was all what? In vain. And that is what Jesus is saying about our worship attendance, about our participation in worship events and moments. And that is what he's saying to the religious frauds of his day. Despite all the memorization, despite all the rituals, despite all the fasting, despite all the religious garb that they would wear, despite all the time they spent memorizing scriptures, it was in vain. all of it. Because no amount of religious observance can compensate for an impure, a misaligned heart. Now, if this has you wondering exactly what in the world your heart is that Jesus keeps referring to, this is the simplest way that I can express it. My heart is who and what I truly am. That's my heart. When I am not performing, when I am not pretending, when I am not putting on my best clothes or my best behavior or my best face, my heart is who I actually am. And your heart is who you are in your most authentic state, your most real moment. Listen, I will never tell you that what you do does not matter. I will not tell you that the choices you make do not matter. We talk a lot about behavior and choices in our teaching. They do matter a lot, but your heart matters more because your heart drives the choices that you make. It defines who you are in God's eyes. When the prophet Samuel saw David's oldest brother, he thought, this guy is so imposing, he's so impressive, he's so handsome, he must be the one that God is selecting from this family to be the king of Israel. But God reminded Samuel, the Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We do, don't we? We judge by the outward appearance. It's really all we have to go on. But God sees your heart, and he evaluates you based on the condition of your heart. So God is looking past your words. He's looking past your actions. He's looking past your presence in this place or your presence online. If your hair is perfect, but your heart is messy, God knows it. And that's why God has given so much instruction and so many warnings about our hearts. Guard your heart. Seek the Lord with all your heart. Worship God from the heart. Hide God's word in your heart. Don't let your heart grow cold. Don't harden your heart. Don't let your heart drift far from God. You and I can only evaluate one another based on what we see and hear, outward things. And to a point, the Bible teaches us that we should observe those things. We should draw conclusions. But there is always more to us than what we are saying and what we are doing. Friend, the reason your words and actions matter is because they originate in your heart. They tell the story of your heart. Jesus said, it is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you. Out of where? Out of our hearts. The sins that reveal themselves in our behavior, they originate in our hearts. You know what this means? It means that when you and I try to transfer blame for our bad behavior to someone else, that we are doing what the Bible calls, what's that Bible word? Tripping. That's the word. We're fooling ourselves. Well, I said that hateful thing. I became that angry. I did that mean thing because of what you did. I engaged in that sin because that person tempted me. Well, nice try. But we are not corrupted by what other people do to us. We are corrupted by what is inside of us. If you drop a container on the floor, the only thing that can spill out of that container is what is already in it. You can't tempt me to do an evil thing that I do not already have the capacity or the inclination to do. How did James say it? Remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from, say those next three words with me, our own desires. Some versions of the Bible say our evil desires, which entice us and drag us away. You talk about an inconvenient truth. Every sin I've ever committed can be traced back to the sinfulness of my own heart. So friend, if you think Christianity and faith are all about the rules, all about the behavior. You need to look deeper. You need to go another layer in. Behavior does matter, but Jesus wants to transform your behavior by transplanting his heart in you. You will never be a good enough rule follower to generate a new heart or anything that looks like it on your own. But God can give you a new heart. Even back in the Old Testament where we sometimes wrongly say it's all about the rules and the laws, even back there, God said this through Ezekiel, I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit in you. I will take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my spirit in you so that you will follow my decrees and be careful to obey my regulations. You see, that's what we need. We don't need to slap a coat of religious paint on our old hearts. We need new hearts. Do you see how this works? God gives you a new heart, and then you allow that heart to empower you to obey him. Blessed are the pure in heart. When we hear the word purity, what do we think of? I mean, if you answer that question, water, you're more pure than I am. Most of us would admit that the word purity makes us think of sex and sexual sin. So when we hear Jesus say, blessed are the pure in heart, it would be easy for us to assume that Jesus is doing the sex talk. He wants to talk about keeping sex where it belongs. And though the Bible has a lot to say about sexual conduct, Jesus is not focusing on that specific aspect of our lives here. The word pure is used dozens of times in the New Testament, and it always carries the same meaning. Pure means uncontaminated. It means free from germs and impurities. It means consistent. In other words, it means the same through and through. So when Jesus calls you and me to purity of heart, he is teaching us to have undivided hearts. No compartments in our hearts that we keep for other things. No chambers in our hearts reserved for other priorities. One theologian said, purity of heart is to want one thing. And I can't say it better. Jesus is saying, when your life is about one thing, then you will see God. You will experience God's presence. You will see God at work in your life. You will enter God's presence in eternity. And Jesus said this way of living is not a burden. It is a blessing. The enemy of your soul wants you to believe that having a singular focus in your heart is too difficult. He wants you to think it would be a great burden to you, but the opposite is true. What's killing you inside is your divided heart. What is stressing you out is all the things that are competing for the priority position in your heart because you haven't given it to God. Jesus wants you to have his peace. Not artificial peace, not temporary peace like the world gives, not circumstantial peace. He wants you to know that reserving your heart for God is the blessed life. That's the good life. That's the kind of life that fills you with peace, that goes beyond our understanding and doesn't fade out. I think this is why many of us cannot say that our faith is genuinely a source of joy for us. I mean, we don't want to let go of our faith, but if we were to give a really honest statement about our faith, we would not say it's a source of great joy for us. If we spoke the truth, some of us would say our faith is making us miserable because we feel torn inside. Why? Because we want multiple things. We have competing priorities in our hearts. We have mixed motives. Look at what Jesus' brother James said. Come close to God, and he will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Do you hear what he's saying? God seems distant because your heart is too crowded. If you are miserable spiritually, or at least you're not fulfilled spiritually, the answer is not for you to find a middle ground because your heart was not created to thrive at a happy medium. Your heart is made to be filled by God alone. You've tried the half-hearted approach. It is killing you inside. So friend, try surrendering your whole heart. Starting today, give your heart, your whole being to Jesus Christ. Live an undivided life. Discover what that means. Why? Because blessed are the pure in heart. Happy are the pure in heart. Fulfilled are those whose hearts are about one thing. Satisfied are the pure in heart. Now look, don't misunderstand me. If you have concerns about your health, about your kids, about your finances, you got real life stuff pressing in on you, acknowledging those concerns and dealing with those concerns does not mean that your heart is divided. That's not what it means to live for God alone. Purity of heart means that you're just not seeking solutions that discount God. You're not looking for solutions outside of your faith and then turning back to your faith when you think you've dealt with those things. The Apostle Paul was a one-thing kind of man. He was a person whose heart was turned over to God. But Paul wrote, not only this one thing I do, he lived that. He surrendered to Jesus, but Paul wrote about his time in prison. He wrote about his health challenges. He wrote about his concern for his friends. He wrote about his imminent death. He did not ignore all of those things, but Paul looked at all of those things through the lens of God's love, God's power, God's presence. He could see that God was with him. He could see that God loved him. And he reserved his whole heart for God. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 4. Look at how intense it was for him. He says, we are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Friend, those are serious challenges. Paul's enemies were playing Hunger Games with his life, but he viewed all of it through a heart that was lived for God. And look at the difference that it made. A few verses later, in verse 16, that is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them all and will last forever. Friend, if your heart is divided, you will only see God's hand in your life when your troubles subside, when your problems dissolve for a while. You'll only feel blessed when things are going great. But if your heart is true to God, you will realize that God is with you, strengthening you, providing for you, even when your troubles are mounting. When your heart is pure, even the most serious problems in life seem lighter and smaller, and you will see God at work in your life, in your difficulties, and in your blessing.